So we're in a section of Matthew's Gospel. That's what we've been working through on Sunday mornings recently. And we're approaching the point of Jesus' death, betrayal and death and resurrection. But as we walk toward that, Jesus is presenting himself in a lot different light than what his followers were imagining. They were thinking this Messiah figure, this future king of Israel, this savior figure will be a political savior. We're being oppressed by the Roman Empire and by different kings that have been set up in our midst. And this Messiah figure is going to come, and there's going to be a takeover. And even experiences that Jesus and his followers, his three closest perhaps friends, Peter, James, and John, had on a mountain where Jesus starts glowing divinely. And then Moses and Elijah make an appearance. And they were thinking, this is the takeover. These are the superheroes we've been waiting for. But yet Jesus starts to emphasize things like his death. And you realize that what he's really in it for this time around is being a suffering servant. And so we learn a lot about what it means to serve people and what it means to be humble in these chapters 15 through 20 or so of the book of Matthew. And so we're kind of progressing. We're in the midst of that right now in chapter 18. Some of you perhaps have children of your own. Others of you will soon. Others of you are maybe in the grandparent stage, or you just know kids in the neighborhood, or you have nieces and nephews. But most of us have some sort of contact with children in our lives. You work in education, and you see them all the time. And one thing that I overlook a lot, that I forget a lot, is how much I have to learn from children. And we have a few children ourselves. And I've learned actually a lot of things from them. I've learned a lot about forgiveness. I've actually learned a lot about love. Learned a lot about what it means to trust someone and what it means to depend on someone, because I'm a very independent person myself. I have had times where I have responded so wrong to one of my kids, and later that night at bedtime, they'll make a comment like, "Dad, I think you're the best dad in the world." And I think, where did that come from? If I were in those shoes, I probably would say something like, "I think you're the worst dad in the world." But yet there's this incredible capacity for forgiveness after I've blown it. I think about how my kids just trust that when they open the door to the refrigerator, there's going to be plenty of stuff there. Or when they sit down at the table or they run through the living room to grab a plate of food at night, it's just going to magically have appeared for them. Their clothes are just going to be clean. How does that happen? But it does, and they trust me for that, and they trust my wife Christine for that. They trust that they're going to be cared for. They come to us when they need simple things, like a Band-Aid for a cut, and that happens often, or a diaper change for our youngest, or help putting a ponytail in a scrunchie or hair tie. And one of the things that still blows my mind is how they will come to us and they'll ask us for permission to do things like eat a piece of candy, or play with friends, or watch TV. I can't remember the last time I asked anyone for permission to do any of those three things. And I don't understand why my kids even realize a need to ask me for that. I'm thankful that they do, but it kind of boggles my mind that they're asking for permission for these things. All these concepts are things that as an adult I have lost touch with a long time ago. But seeing it in the lives of my children and other kids, it's a reminder that I really need these things. And so Jesus is going to use some examples this morning that are going to revolve around a little child that he calls to stand in the middle of his students as he's teaching them for an illustration. And so we're going to consider the children today. And hopefully we'll be reminded of some things that we might have long since forgotten a need for today. Just a little background. This story takes place in the village called Capernaum. It's where Jesus' home base is throughout his 3.5 years of ministry or so that most of the New Testament Gospels describe. And so he's moving in and out of this village of Capernaum. Peter's home is there. So it may have even been one of Peter's children or one of his other followers' children or just a neighbor boy that's invited into the midst. We don't know that. Also, this is about 3 to 4 weeks before Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. And so things, again, are progressing toward Jesus' journey to the cross at this point in time. And right before this, Jesus' disciples, his students, have been arguing about who will get the best position under Jesus when he becomes king over Israel. Because they think that this is imminent. It's going to be a massive takeover. He's going to harness supernatural powers and conquer Rome. And they want to know, like, who gets to sit on the right side of Jesus? Who's second in command? And so they're fighting about this. And Jesus takes this as a wonderful opportunity to shed some light into how we really should be thinking as representatives of Jesus. And it really drives us toward, first of all, humility. Jesus is not looking for what many people in this world are looking for. And this is how the story starts. This is in Matthew 18:1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" So in God's kingdom, when you become king, like, who's going to be the greatest? How do you size up greatness? And at this point in time in the Roman world, I think it's important to step into first century Israel and first century Rome and how things operate. And I think if we look at how they operate then, we'll see that it's not too far away from how they operate here in 2023 in the United States of America. Because at this point in time, greatness is determined by somebody's position, what kind of achievements they've made, what kinds of positions they hold in society, or by how much power somebody has, or by the number of people that look up to this individual, man or woman, for money. Or maybe they look up to them for ideas. Maybe they look up to them for direction and the decisions that they're going to make. Or perhaps for entertainment. Or maybe for influence. I want an ear of somebody in power, and I know you have some influence, and so I'll talk to you about that because you are great. Or maybe it's somebody who can provide you with happiness. This person can make me happy. And those are all the ways that society at this point in time viewed great people in the midst. It's kind of depressing for me sometimes because I think about how I fit into society often, and I don't have a lot of those marks of greatness as the world defines it. And maybe you feel similarly about yourself. You feel kind of ordinary sometimes. Later on in Matthew, a couple of chapters in the future, we'll get to this in a few more weeks, but in chapter 20, verse 25, they're having the same conversation. So they obviously didn't learn everything they were meant to learn from this experience. But in that future conversation, Jesus says, the rulers of the nations, they remind people that they are the masters. And the great ones here on earth exercise their power and their privileges. So Jesus kind of reiterates that point that we just covered. And again, not much has changed. But Jesus' disciples, they ask an important question. What's greatness in God's kingdom? And the answer to that is entirely different than greatness in the world that Jesus lived in at this point in time and his disciples, and the world that we live in right now in 2023. This is how he answered that question. It says he called a child to himself and stood him among them. So you've got these students that are hovered around Jesus in the room perhaps, or outside, maybe under a tree, and Jesus calls this little child into the middle of them to stand up. And he says, if you want to distinguish yourself as somebody who's great, imitate this kid who's standing here right in front of you. And he says, truly, this is the truth. I tell you, unless you change and become like children, like this boy that's in the midst of you, you're not even going to get into God's kingdom. You won't even enter the kingdom of heaven. And so I want us to think about for a moment, what is it about a child that's necessary to enter into God's kingdom? And what is it about a child that's necessary to imitate? Why does that make our life so much more great in God's eyes? What are these things? So let's maybe pause and think about that for a few moments. And I think as far as entering into God's kingdom in the first place, it's neat that children, they really trust in their parents' provision. They trust their parents to provide everything they need. And I'll give you a few examples about how our kids really rely on us, and maybe you have children that rely on you to just take care of these very basic needs in their lives. They might not make it, if you weren't there to provide these basic essentials. But they trust their parents are going to provide. And a similar trust is really necessary even to enter into God's kingdom. Think about a couple of other places in the New Testament where Jesus and where the Apostle Paul kind of weighed in on this. How do you enter into God's kingdom? Jesus uses an illustration in John's Gospel in chapter 10, and he says, truly I tell you, anyone who doesn't enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way is a thief and a robber. And so he takes this sheepfold, or you could say a cattle pen or something like that in today's lingo, and he makes an illustration between that and how you get into God's kingdom. And he says, you've got to go through the gate. If you just climb over, that doesn't count. Robbers do that. It's not a genuine way to get in. And then he says, truly I tell you, I'm the gate for the sheep. If you want to be included in God's sheepfold and God's kingdom, you've got to come in through me. He says, all who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep didn't listen to them. I am the gate. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved or rescued, and will come in and go out and find pasture. So you'll be rescued, but then you'll be cared for. He says, I've come so they might have life and have it in abundance. And so if you want to enter into God's kingdom, into an abundant way of living life here and now that extends into eternity, Jesus says, I'm the provision. But as grown-ups, it's so hard for us to trust simply in someone else and their provision because we want to do it ourselves. And honestly, society teaches us that. If you want to be important, if you want to mature, you've got to take care of things yourself. You need to be independent. And yet the very thing that allows us to enter into God's family and God's kingdom is dependence on what only God can provide, what only Jesus himself can be the door into. The Apostle Paul reflects on this in a book called Romans in the New Testament, in chapter 3 of that book. He says, now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been revealed. So if you want to be in a right relationship with God and a right relationship with other humans, which is kind of what righteousness means in the Bible, if you want that kind of a relationship, and he says, by the way, the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, they attest to this. And then he says, the righteousness of God, the way to a right relationship with God and the right relationship with other humans is through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. Jesus is the way into this life and this restored relationship with God and this really restored way of interacting with other humans as well. He's the door. He's the way. But trusting simply in a person, in Jesus, it's hard for us as adults sometimes because it's counterintuitive. We want to depend on ourselves. We want to forge the way. We want to come up with the solution and the answer. And yet we need to become like children or we'll never even make it into this community that God calls his kingdom, God calls his church. Not only that, if we want to be great in this kingdom, in this community, we really have to become more like a child. Jesus says next, this is back to our chapter here, Matthew 18, verse 4. He says, so whoever will humble himself like this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I mean, this child kind of had to humble himself to even come and stand in the midst of this crowd of students, of learners, right? Because this kid could have been playing, with other friends in the neighborhood or just standing over to the side or trying to just stay out of the way. And yet he had to respond to Jesus and he had to come out in the midst. He had to humble himself under Jesus' request. Jesus called him out and he had to step in. And oftentimes we see that with kids that we know in our schools that we teach in, or in our families, or our grandkids, or other children that we know, or kids in the neighborhood. Children just kind of innately position themselves underneath a parent or a caregiver's guidance. It's kind of just what they do. This child in the house did that. And in God's kingdom, God is kind of viewed as the parent. He is the father, and Jesus uses that metaphor a lot. And so the idea is that God provides the guidance for us in his kingdom. And Jesus, as God with us, as Matthew would conclude, provides the guidance for us. And so if God is the father figure, what kind of guidance does he give us? Because we probably need to position ourselves like children do under that guidance. Again, I said I don't understand why my children listen to me sometimes. But they do. And they get that dad cares about me and maybe he sees things that I haven't seen yet. Or he knows something I don't know. Like if all I do is eat candy every day, I might get diabetes. So he cares about me, and we realize God sees things that we don't see. We need to listen to him. Again, a couple chapters forward in Matthew, in chapter 20, Jesus later on will say, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And that word at the time referred to somebody who would run errands or somebody who would wait on tables. So an errand runner or a server at a restaurant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. Serving people that way and being a slave, it just doesn't sound so appealing to many of us. But Jesus said if you want to become great, that's the way. By positioning yourself under that advice that I'm giving. But how do you serve in more specific ways? What kind of advice does God give us, does Jesus give us for serving in his kingdom, or even being a slave-like figure in his kingdom? What does he say? Here's a few things that I've seen from other teaching, mainly in Matthew, also in John's gospel. Something that we might do, first of all, it's probably going to be a lot like Jesus' teaching and the examples that he sets. And I remember a place just before this Last Supper where Jesus had communion with his 12, and just before his crucifixion on the cross, where Jesus wrapped himself in a towel. He took out a bowl of water, and he wiped the dirt and the animal waste and everything else from the dirty streets outside off of each one of his disciples' feet, off of their bare feet before their final meal together. So he humbled himself, and he did humble tasks to bless someone else so they wouldn't have to. Sometimes it means that we resolve conflicts, or we try to reconcile broken relationships. Even though we might be misunderstood, even though that might not work out so well, we humble ourselves. We position ourselves under God's advice to try to resolve conflicts, to try to reconcile relationships, when many people would just be content with walking away and saying, good riddance, I didn't need them in my life anyway. Sometimes we say, I will take care of God's natural world, because after all, in Genesis, he made man and woman to cultivate it. He gave us this responsibility to rule and bring out the potential of his earth. And so maybe that's one way that we submit to Jesus' teaching like a child. Maybe we keep our commitments, even though it's going to cost us something. We made a promise and we realize, if I keep that promise, I'm going to miss out on something, or I'm going to miss out on money, or I have a schedule conflict, and I really would rather do the other thing. But yet we made the promise. Maybe it's giving up our rights, because giving up our rights will benefit someone else, or it will help us avoid offending someone who's really sincere. Maybe it's doing whatever we can to meet other needs that we see around us. Maybe it's giving up surplus or extra that we have in our lives so that we can help bring equality in the community of God's followers and God's kingdom, so that somebody who's really suffering and really hurting, doesn't have adequate resources, can live a little bit better, and we give up a little bit of our luxury in return. Maybe it's alleviating someone's suffering. Maybe it's having a conversation about why we have hope, or how someone who's really struggling with guilt can find forgiveness. Maybe it's blessing someone with kindness who mistreats us. Maybe it's praying for our friends, but also praying for people who treat us like enemies, or we maybe even feel are our enemies. Maybe it's trying to love our neighbors around our street or cul-de-sac just as much as we love ourselves. And those are all different ways that we position ourselves under Jesus' teaching and Jesus' example. But that's what children do. But if we want greatness in God's eyes, it's by becoming less. Verse 5, Jesus says, whoever receives one such child, again, still referring to the boy in the room, in my name receives me. He also goes on, and this is fast forwarding just slightly to chapter 19, because there's a small comment about children there that I think applies here. Up a chapter and a half in Matthew, it says, at another time, little children were brought to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and to pray over them. But the disciples, they rebuked them. So why are you bothering Jesus? Don't bring your kids here. Jesus has important things to do. Don't bring your kids here for him to pray over. He's clearly healing people and teaching people, and they're just getting in the way. And Jesus said, leave those kids alone. Don't hinder them from coming to me, because the kingdom of heaven is like these. And he places his hands on them, and he prays for them, and then he moves on. And it just reminds us, whether we're in chapter 18 or 19, that God views children as precious, but children kind of understand that they're precious. They'll just approach their parents, or they approach Jesus in this verse, or they even stand in the midst of these people because they realize that they're cared for and they're loved. And because kids are precious, maybe we should invite kids into our lives, or maybe into our tasks or our conversations or our activities, because these children are precious, and if we receive them, if we welcome them and invite them into our lives, we're really doing it as a representative of Jesus. And it's really, Jesus views it the same as if we would have welcomed him into our midst. But kids are so free sometimes to approach us. But do we push them out? I think of a story. So we did a church cleanup project here about a month ago, right before Easter. And I have a son who's 6 years old, and he wanted to be involved in helping in some of these different projects. And Dave, our treasurer, who spoke a little bit earlier about the stucco project, he was up on a ladder and he was changing out some fluorescent tube lights out of these light fixtures in the hallway. And he came over to my 6-year-old son and invited him into this process. He said, "You want to help me out?" And so my son was holding up these tube lights and handing them up to Dave while he's up on his ladder and putting these lights in. Now, I guarantee you my son did not make Dave's process more efficient. It probably took him significantly longer to welcome my son into that process. But you know what? It made a huge impression, and it made him feel welcome and like he belonged. And the reality is, when you invite children into your life and your experience, if you're cooking and you ask them to cook with you, if you're cleaning and you ask them to clean with you, if you're going on an activity, even like a walk, and you invite a child who's this tall along, your pace is going to be like 1/5 of what it would be normally. So you're going to lose efficiency, but what you're going to gain is making a huge impression and building a relationship with that child and focusing on how important he or she is. And so that's part of humility, is becoming like children, but also inviting children into our lives and experiences as adults, not seeing them as inconveniences, but rather as other members of Christ's kingdom who he dearly loves. And not only that, but as examples who challenge us with things that we forget about as adults. I want to conclude this morning with just a caution that Jesus gives concerning children, and not just children, but he takes it one more level. In verse 6, he says, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it's better for him," and then he goes on, we'll get into that in a moment. So Jesus transitions terms here. He changes terms. He doesn't talk about this child in the room, he talks about little ones. And whenever Jesus starts talking about little ones, it's not just little children. Little children are a part of this group, but it also goes far beyond that. Little ones, sometimes it might refer to people who are young in their faith. Sometimes it's young in age, sometimes it's young in their faith. Sometimes it's people who just take on a servant's posture. Somebody who's willing to serve like anyone and everyone. And sometimes people who are willing servants, they get taken advantage of all the time, because other people think, well, if you're going to be a servant, I'll just let you. You seem to be happy doing it, so serve away. In fact, let me give you a list of things you can do to serve me, right? So they're easy to take advantage of. The little ones, or the least of these, as is translated some places in the New Testament, it also can refer to people who are in states of inadequacy. So they feel like they don't have what's adequate in life. Maybe they feel depressed even because of that. Or people who are dealing with brokenness. Maybe it's a situation or a traumatic experience. Maybe it's grief that causes them to feel broken. Or it can be poverty. They physically lack the basic needs in life. Or it can be people who are powerless because of whatever position they have in society or lack thereof. They just don't have the power to have influence or make certain decisions, or they're part of groups that are pushed to the edge by society. Marginalized is another word we might use. Thought of as unimportant or avoided by society. It can be people who are in distress. It can be people who are being oppressed. So some sort of, even persecution or even physical harm. All these groups of people are vulnerable, and many people in God's kingdom are part of these different groups. And so Jesus is focusing now not just on the child in the room, but on a broader category of these vulnerable people that we encounter that are probably here in this room this morning, honestly. I'm sure many of us fit these categories in different ways. But we have to be careful not to trip up or to cause to stumble. It's a term that Jesus is going to use a lot in this passage. People in these categories. And Jesus views people who are vulnerable very seriously. In fact, he says in the next statement, it's better for him that a donkey's grinding stone, or some translations say millstone, be hung around his neck and that he be sunk or drowned in the open sea. Like, this is serious stuff. In my mind, for the longest time, I thought, why did Jesus pull out an example like this? Like, who says it'd be better for a big millstone to be hung around somebody's neck and, than be drowned in the sea? Where did he get this? This was actually a Roman capital punishment method at this point in time. So various places in the Roman Empire, they did lots of crucifixions to kill people, criminals, or whatever. But occasionally they'd vary things up and they'd just put a big heavy stone around somebody's neck and then sink them in the ocean, in the sea, in the Mediterranean. And it was another way of executing criminals. And so Jesus is drawing on this comparison, this motif of something that's considered a serious, almost a heinous crime, something that deserves capital punishment. So that's where he's drawing us into. If you're going to cause or chip up one of these vulnerable people in my kingdom, you deserve what those people deserve who are punished by the Roman Empire in these extreme ways. In verse 7, he says, woe, and that's an expression of grief. When you see woe in the New Testament, it's like somebody's mourning in their head. Woe to the world, because stumbling blocks, things that trip people up, come from it. So in this world, you can't avoid things that trip other people up. For it's inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but he says, woe to the person through whom the stumbling block comes. The person who throws the tripping hazard out on somebody else, maybe even intentionally. Like Jesus is grieving people's response like that to other people. So I want to just pause here and talk about these stumbling blocks or tripping hazards. What might tripping hazards be? What might harm people who are vulnerable or young in their faith or even young in age, or people who are willing servants and trying to serve as many people as possible? What might cause them to trip up? What might offend them? What might hurt them? It might be temptations that somebody would throw in front of them. It might be exclusion. You're a part of a vulnerable group or some group that I disagree with for whatever reason, so I will exclude you, even though you are a follower of Jesus. It might be restrictions that we put on someone. Even think of like burdens or legalistic requirements or extra rules that we try to place on people to be spiritual, that God actually doesn't ever mention or intend to be placed on people. The Pharisees in Jesus' day were good at loading people up with all these rules to follow. Jesus was critical of that. Or traditions. Maybe it's insults that we hurl at these people. Maybe it's partiality. I'll show favoritism to these people because they have more resources. They are great in the world's eyes, and you are less in the world's eyes, even though you might be great in God's kingdom. Maybe it's persecution, or maybe it's just judging people. We're really good at being judgmental sometimes, but those can be stumbling blocks. Maybe it's lies that we would spread about someone, or assumptions or stereotypes we put on people. Or maybe it's even throwing out doubts to people who are really young in their faith and saying, well, is God really like this? Do you really think it could be that easy? Could Jesus really be the doorway into God's kingdom? It's got to be harder than that. Anything that people might throw in the way that's aimed at these more vulnerable people. He says, woe to the person through whom that comes. He says, if your hand or your foot is causing you to stumble, and I think he's talking about causing you to stumble into causing other people to stumble here. So like if you're stumbling by causing these people to stumble, if your hand or foot's causing it, he says, cut it off and throw it away. It's pretty extreme. Jesus is using hyperbole here, okay? It's better for you to enter life maimed or without a foot than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into the eternal fire. So he's contrasting life in his kingdom, in God's community, in God's family, the entrance of which is through Jesus, that with some eternal state that's more comparable with fire, something that destroys or consumes. So you can have life or you can have destruction, basically. You can be on these 2 different paths, right? He says if your eye is causing you to stumble, if it's throwing you into this wrong path, tear it out and throw it away from you. What he's saying is if you find yourself committing these injustices toward people, you should probably do whatever it takes to change your way so that you're walking in a way that leads to life instead of in a way that leads to death and destruction, even from an eternal standpoint. He says it's better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into and then there's different translations here. Literally, it actually reads Gehenna of fire. This is actually a criminal allusion as well. So Gehenna, the valley of Gehenna is a valley on the south side of the city of Jerusalem. And at this point in time, in Jesus' point, it's where they would put trash to burn. It's where they would put bodies of dead animals to burn. It's where they would actually put criminals' bodies to be burned instead of burying them. And I think that's kind of what Jesus is drawing off of here. He's already talked about the millstone around the person's neck and that type of punishment. And now he's talking about the people who have been done criminal things so that their bodies would be disposed of in this valley by burning instead of given a proper burial at this point in time. So he's saying, essentially, it's better for you to do whatever it needs to change your ways than to destroy weak and wounded people and deserve consequences like Roman capital punishment or a grave in Gehenna because you're really treating people as a criminal would or with injustice. And then he says, pay attention to this so that you don't look down on one of these little ones. So you don't think less of people in these categories, and so you don't treat people in these categories as less. Pay attention so you don't do that. And he gives them one more thing to think about besides their own path in life or even their pathway through life and into eternity. Finally, he says, for I say this to you, because their angels in heaven continually look at the face of my Father who is in heaven. He says, let me give you one more thing to think about. They have angels, and their angels are constantly looking at the face of God the Father in heaven. I think of that first song that Jeremiah included, the Whom Shall I Fear, the God of Angel Armies song. It's really interesting because we didn't plan that at all, but it fits so well today. And I think Jesus would have us step back and consider the fact that if we are willing to, again, wound people, destroy people in these ways, these people are not without a defense. Psalm 34, verse 6, it says, this poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him from all his troubles. Not just financially poor, but poor in the Old Testament is used to describe all these different types of people who have kind of been just ran over by the world in different ways, and they lack things, different things in life. So the Lord heard him and saved him from all of his troubles. How did this happen? Verse 7, it says, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and rescues them. So he says God's angel army, at least the angel of the Lord in this verse, he was camped around, like militarily camped around this poor person, and he's going to step in and rescue him. And so when we think less of children or certain categories of people and we treat them like they are less, it might actually put us in conflict with spiritual beings who God has stationed to serve and protect and rescue these people. So Jesus is saying, think twice before you step on these people. Be a lot more like a child. And love a lot more like a child in the process. So he's given us strong things to consider, but overall, he's asking us to consider the children. Consider the way that children think and act and relate, and consider the vulnerability of children and other people who are in similar states. So how do we take something away from this morning? I kind of trust that God, if he wants to speak to you about something, he'll impress your mind and your heart with something, but I want to leave you with a few questions that you might consider throughout the week if you'd like to as well as we dismiss. First of all, up until right now, this moment, how have you imagined and defined greatness in life? What do you think a great life is? And in light of some of these things that Jesus has brought up, are there ways that you should rethink your concept of what it means to be great? Secondly, what's one way that you should be more like a little child? I guarantee you we can all learn a lot from kids. We think that kids have to learn from us, but it really works both ways. What's one way that you should be a little more like a child? Third, what is one thing you can do to invite a child or maybe a vulnerable person, these least of these, the little ones that we talked about, into your life this week? Maybe it'll slow you down. Maybe it'll inconvenience you, take longer. But how can you involve a child or a vulnerable person in something that you're doing this week? It'll make you more like Jesus. It'll make you greater in God's kingdom. Fourth, what challenges might you need to overcome to include children and vulnerable people in your life more often? If this is going to become a habit, what's going to get in the way of that? Maybe it's a way of thinking, or maybe it's just a routine that you have that's not conducive for involving those types of people. I don't know. 5th, have you been placing any tripping hazards in the way of someone in your life or hurting someone who is weak or wounded? Again, just questions for reflection and change. And then who defends the people others look down on? We say, well, I learned something today. It's angels, but shouldn't it be us? Shouldn't it be us? Why should they have to step in? If God has representatives all over the face of this planet, maybe it could be us. This is not on your bulletins. I'm going to put it on the screen just so that if you're watching online or if you want to access this online on our YouTube channel later, you can. So maybe you say, well, it's been a long time, like 50 years since I've done anything with small children. I wouldn't even know what to do. Here's some ideas of different ways that you might play or interact with young children. Here's a couple thoughts. You could do a funny animal walk. This works with like 3 years old or under. Don't try this with a 10-year-old. Take turns calling out animal names and walking like that animal for 30 seconds. You could do something called a funny face freeze. Make a funny face and see who can hold their funny face the longest without laughing. Again, this is younger children. If you have teenagers, probably not going to work. Draw the top or bottom half of an animal or an imaginary creature and let a little child draw the other half. Play hide and seek. Set up a paper airplane runway or target and help the kids fold and throw planes. Design a 10-item scavenger hunt and help younger children hunt for those items on the list. Blow bubbles and let a kid try to catch them. Works through probably age 10. My kids seem to still enjoy that. Play catch with a balloon or help a little child bat it to keep it from touching the ground. Help a young child cut out shapes in Play-Doh or kinetic sand. These are just different ways to connect in addition to like letting them help you with the things that you're already doing or join you on the activities you're already doing. There's lots of ways to incorporate children into our lives.